Hi everyone, my name is Armando Lara-Millan. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at UC Berkeley. I'm pleased to welcome Chima Anyadike-Danes to the Institute of East Asian Studies here at UC Berkeley. Chima is currently a doctoral student at UC Irvine in the Department of Anthropology, having advanced to candidacy in 2013. We're getting a chance to listen to evolving research. He just told me we're going to get a version of a chapter he's working on. After 2 years of intensive field work, Chima holds a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Cambridge, as well as another master's degree from UC Irvine. The dissertation research was supported by numerous fellowships, and I think you'll agree is cutting-edge research on urban communities, migration, law, identity, race, nationhood, and the continual negotiation of meaning in the urban landscape. Please welcome me in having Chima join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the Mongolia Initiative and the Institute for East Asian Studies and Professor Lara-Millan, Dr. Kerry, and Dr. Frank Bier for inviting me to come to Berkeley to talk about this. Let me begin. This presentation's overarching argument is that the experience of Mongolian immigrants to Los Angeles are shaped by settler colonialism. Specifically, I want to suggest because the municipality's approach to recognition has been informed by its settler colonial history. This history has led to the development of a particular form of vision, one that equates recognizable physical presence in the form of a particular relationship to the landscape with political recognition. My exploration of recognition in LA and its implications for Mongolians draws on three ideas: entanglement, taskscape, and landscape. You can sort of see definitions up there. Entanglement is the interlacing of materials with a whole suite of ways in which humans and things depend on each other. It is part of a broader turn in archaeology that stresses that things, materials, and landscapes possess real qualities affecting and shaping both our perception of them and our cohabitation with them. James Clifford's Identity in Mashpee, an account of the history of the Mashpee natives' 1970s court appeal for recognition of tribal status, provides a vivid example of this notion of entanglement. The judge questioned a Mashpee youth about his headband, specifically why he was wearing it, and if it was an Indian headband. The youth answers that he bought it at a store. The judge concluded in a tone conveying a palpable sense of disappointment that it was an ordinary red bandana. This disappointment is suggestive of the importance of material culture and history for recognition. History, in this instance, being landscapes, which record the routine engagements between things and beings. These landscapes are continually reconfigured through practical operation carried out by a skilled agent as part of his or her normal business of life. Together, these operations constitute what I would call a taskscape. LA's taskscape is a product of beings and things, and the things that populate it. From Mongolians living in Koreatown's apartment buildings to the ficus roots growing in its streets. Only by learning to engage one's senses can one know these histories, otherwise they remain invisible, unknowable. My work on the specific entangling of political recognition with sensorial recognition in LA's landscape builds upon 2 years of fieldwork, research at the city archives, participant observation of a range of sites, and interviews with Mongolian community members and other stakeholders. To understand this entangling, I examined the city's settler colonial history, tracing out the vital role that recognition played in determining access to resources from 1781 onwards. I then consider the Los Angeles Mongolian Association, henceforth LAMA, attempts to gain recognition by campaigning to have renamed an area of Koreatown, and how concerns about recognition so animated one Korean American community organizer that he became interested in signifying Koreanness through tree planting. Finally, I discuss how and why Mongolians continue to be recognized only fleetingly. By October 2013, my visits to LA City Archives to examine their collection of early city charters were so frequent that they felt routine. I'd become comfortable. Then, I unexpectedly encountered municipal bylaws discussing Indians. Belatedly, I realized that any account of the municipality's development of recognition as a technology had to begin with settler colonialism, as it shapes all logics of inclusion and exclusion in settler law, as Scott Morganson observes. These logics of exclusion rely on what the recently departed Patrick Wolf has called elimination. Territorial claims are legitimated by disposing of natives through practices like assimilation, the renaming of toponyms or place names, and genocide. While I have mentioned humans, elimination is best understood as a multi-species endeavor. Here I focus on practices of inclusion and exclusion, specifically as they relate to trees and toponyms in LA, to understand how geopolitical recognition is entangled with landscape creation and what that has meant for Mongolians. What you see over here is a Tongva. The Tongva are the native inhabitants of Los Angeles' attempt at remapping LA in indigenous terms, an attempt at reclaiming LA. LA was founded on September of 1781 in a now extinct prairie ecosystem. Like much of California, Franciscan missionaries named it. They came to California in 1769 to convert natives and solidify Spanish territorial claims. In the LA area, they founded Mission San Gabriel, ministered to Tongva, and baptized willing, I stress willing, converts. Conversion was a major cultural transformation. Tongva adopted Spanish culture, became gente de razón, that sort of people of reason, by internalizing the need to manage instincts for the good of the social organization. Mediterranean-influenced agriculture was regarded as the method for the Tongva to gain reason, and so they tended the newly introduced trees, oranges, citrons, limes, apples, pears, peaches, pomegranates, figs, and olives, a whole host of trees that formidably and forcefully changed Los Angeles' landscape. While missionaries regarded property rights as stemming from reason, the Tongva had a different set of beliefs. They believed they had specific obligations to their land as it was gifted to them by the Creator. Many Tongva continued to try and shape the landscape through tasks like hunting antelope, gathering herbs, and controlled burning. The last perhaps is the most significant, both because the missionaries deeply opposed it and because it allowed them to exert control over the vertical structure of the region's vegetation, specifically allowing for the growing of acorns, which were a vital source of protein. Eventually, secular authorities came to see missions and Indians alike as a hindrance. LA's creation was a response to this. It was intended to attract settlers, offset Mission San Gabriel Archangel's power, and supply the presidios being the sort of military bases. Then in 1784, retired soldiers living in Southern California petitioned and were granted large ranchos, so ranches, from land not occupied by the mission. Tongvan rancheros, rancheros means Indian villages, or LA's common land. These land grants were contingent on them altering the landscape through large-scale agriculture. Ranchers were required to build a dwelling and graze roughly 2,000 heads of cattle, so sort of a major environmental transformation. Surrounding Tongvan rancheros like Yanga were instrumental to LA's development. They supplied the labor. This was a practice that the Franciscans frowned upon greatly because it was sort of felt that the ranchos were undercutting their conversion of the natives. Then in 1821, Mexico achieved independence, but the new state worried about Franciscan loyalty and secularized the missions. The Franciscans left California, while many natives migrated to LA. Mission lands, which were notionally to be returned to the natives upon the acquisition of reason, largely went to a few settlers. These new Californios relied on abundant native labor to build wealth. Raising huge herds and participating in a maritime trade in hide and tallow, they transformed LA's taskscape into an export-led economy. The U.S. conquest of California in the 1840s led to further structural changes. Particularly, land was now taxable, and most ranchos were now only marginally profitable. Consequently, numerous Californios were bankrupted, and their ranchos sold to American consortiums who began the now ubiquitous Los Angeles practice of land speculation. Meanwhile, the American Senate declared the remaining native lands terra nullius. The American conquest saw a shift in concern from natives' reasons to races' intellectual capability. California natives seemed to many like animals, it was said. while Mexicans were regarded as a mixed, incapable race who never should have managed California in the first place. Neither population was regarded as making proper productive use of the land, and that proper productive use is something I will return to again and again. By the late 19th century, Angelenos believed the Tongva eliminated. Seemingly the only remnants of their presence were toponyms like Malibu, Topanga, and Pacoima, but below LA's surface there lurked a shadow geography of places and rights whose existence was largely unacknowledged. Indeed, many Tongva regarded and encouraged this misapprehension as positive. They intermarried, passed as Mexicans, and submerged themselves with the Basques and other disenfranchised in downtown Los Angeles. Anglophone Angelenos regarded these disenfranchised immigrant populations as a problem and restricted their movements as they had done with the native populations. In the Spanish colonial period, cartography had been used to dispose and dispossess natives and create newly named territories. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, municipal authorities also employed biopower in the form of the science of social work and also public health to render these neighborhoods eliminable. So if you take that on board, now let me talk about a specific example where you'll see this sort of transition from natives to immigrants in this way. La Fiesta de Los Angeles is perhaps the best example of how Anglophone settler colonialism linked this elimination to recognition. The first of these was held in 1894 during economic downturn to fire public imagination. A mammoth seventh-day parade with a series of floats was held downtown. Amongst the floats was an evolutionary parade representing LA's diversity. Fiesta planners, boasting that not many cities could produce representatives of 4 out of the 5 human races, Caucasians, Mongolians, Africans, and red men from residents of its immediate locality. For those of you who are watching this later, I must stress the Mongolians in question were merely Asians as opposed to specifically sort of Mongolians from Mongolia. These red men, however, were not Tongva, but Quechuan, imported from a reservation near Yuma, and these races were recognized only insofar as they glorified LA as an emergent cosmopolitan metropolis. The Tongva and Californios were relegated to a Spanish fantasy, the complex ways they shaped and indeed shaped the landscape unacknowledged. The display did not acknowledge the city's diverse immigrant population's role in creating landscapes either. The Chinese development of orange groves, which helped refashion LA's landscape into the Buster's Eden, went unmentioned. La Fiesta ended in the 1920s, but it made an important contribution to linking the recognition of otherness within the city to festive events. It decontextualized participants, reconstituting them in the service of the city's bullish boosterism. Further evidence of this practice exists in the faux neighborhoods rooted in fantasy created to replace those which, like the old Chinatown, have been destroyed by development. In the 1920s, booster Christine Sterling successfully advocated for the creation of Olivera Street. It celebrated a version of the city's Mexican past that was inspired as much by the Mexican muralism as by the city's history. The development replaced a lush botanical park populated by non-native species used to sell LA to potential residents. Similarly, in the late 1930s, the Orientalist China City employed film sets rather than Chinatown's original Mexican buildings. You can see sort of some of these film sets here. These developments thus continue the practice of ethnic commodification that were evident in La Fiesta. Okay. LA's Koreatown is superficially similar to LA's early immigrant neighborhoods. Like them, its name is misleading because it is a diverse neighborhood peopled by Central Americans, Mongolians, and Bangladeshis, as well as Koreans. Just as these neighborhoods were corrupting, Koreatown's abundant bars with its B-girls, commissioned to encourage customers to buy drinks, are regarded by the LAPD as corrupting. However, there are differences. Koreatown is larger and its toponym was not imposed. Instead, Korean businessmen campaigned for it beginning in the mid-70s, finally achieving it in the 1980s. This history and the 1992 civil disturbance give that particular toponym a significance, a historical significance. And by civil disturbance, I'm referring to what lay people would call the Rodney King riots. Mongolians begin migrating to Koreatown in the mid-1990s. By the 2000s, chain migration increased the population to a few thousand, and Lama was founded to serve the city's many Mongolian students. By 2010, when I began my fieldwork, Lama, still based in Koreatown, was a community-wide organization. Its expanded remit included cultural preservation, and it had become involved with WCKNC. That's the Wiltshire Centre Koreatown Neighbourhood Council. These shifts correlated with community changes. A substantial minority had become Mongolian Americans. Following the Korean path, they sought a toponym of their own. I have described how the history of recognition in LA is bound up with ideas about appropriate engagement with the landscape. Furthermore, I have emphasized that a multi-species settler colonial taskscape produced LA's landscape. Acknowledging this specific historical context, the planting of street trees in LA's Koreatown cannot be regarded as entirely innocuous, especially when one party seeks to influence the environment's shape to convey Korean ownership. And such practices conveyed strong messages to the Los Angeles Mongolian Association about how one should live in LA. Moreover, knowing the history of multi-species settler colonialism encourages us to be attentive to how contemporary recognition is entangled in a history of settler colonialism informed by discourses and practices of erasure. I first learned about the municipality's tree planting program in February 2014 when I attended a WCKNC meeting. At a board member's request, two representatives from MTLA, Million Trees Los Angeles, explained that it was a good time to plant street trees. A municipal initiative meant they could be bought for a couple $100 per tree, and a board of sanitation initiative meant free concrete cuts. The board were excited, that is WCKNC's board. Cutting was the most expensive and intensive part of the process. WCKNC set up a working group consisting of a board member, two UCLA undergraduates, and myself to handle the application. We arranged a meeting with KYCC's environmental services manager. WCKNC would be paying KYCC to plant and maintain the trees in a very sort of neoliberal process. It's all sort of subcontracted out. But first we needed to agree on the species, their number, and the location. The board needed these details so they could vote on the funding. One early evening in mid-March, the working group met at Cafe Bene, a fashionable Korean chain making inroads into Koreatown. The open-plan industrial layout with its exposed concrete walls, glass doors, and wooden bookshelves resounded with noise. A sound system blared out K-pop classics. The cafe was heaving with people, adolescents studying, a conversational Japanese group, and a juma, that sort of marriage-age woman would be the literal translation, socializing. I sat waiting. 5 minutes later, the others arrived. The initial conversation lasted 45 minutes. Varied topics, WCKNC's history, renters' rights, and planning practices were discussed. Swiftly, a location along Vermont between 7th and Olympic was decided upon, and a number of trees, 33, was agreed upon. An energetic, initially technical discussion about tree species began. KYCC's manager explained that the Bureau of Street Sanitation, as you can see here, anything to do with streets in Los Angeles is extremely complicated. There's sort of 20 or so different agencies involved in any of it at any given moment. The KYCC's manager explained that BSS's website had a database of acceptable trees. The board members had already examined it. He felt the most important criterion was not height or drought resistance, but Koreanness. He mentioned a Koreatown focus group for a different project involving trees had preferred Asianish trees. He then described a scene in which one would be driving up a main thoroughfare and identify Koreatown by its street trees. He drew the Korean members of the working group into this discussion by reminiscing about trees in South Korea. In addition to the Koreanness of the trees, he stressed the importance of seasonal foliage. Then the KYCC manager mentioned the possibility of native trees. The board member dismissed the idea, as such trees would have no impact on the region's indigenous people. They're dead, he suggested. It was too late for them. It was indigenous Koreanness, not indigenous Americanness, that was important in this context. For WCKNC, trees were both potential signifiers of identity and representatives of a Koreatown they hoped for. Between 2012 and 2014, the board was very concerned about Koreanness. During their tenure, several public buildings were named after significant Korean American historical figures, such as Young Oak over here. There were even plans to construct an elaborate archway on Koreatown's main thoroughfare. Koreanness even made an appearance at the WCKNC rest stop for Cyclavia. That's the annual sort of Los Angeles cycling event. A booth's banner asserted Korean rights to Dokdo at this event. Dokdo is these disputed islets between Korea and Japan, a group of small islets whose sovereignty is disputed between South Korea and Japan. Let me return now, though, to the trees, and how ideas about normalcy are consequential for Koreatown's landscape and ideas about recognition. I'm not suggesting, I want to stress here, anthropomorphizing trees. That would be folly. However, as anthropologist Natasha Meyer's work with biologists has demonstrated, trees do live complex lives that are not merely reducible to a series of generalized properties. They, like all other beings resident on the planet, are constantly in the process of coming into being. They grow in all sorts of unpredicted ways. As Tim Ingold observes, the form of a tree is no more given as an immutable fact of nature than is the form of the house an imposition of the human mind. Thus, it is the language of species behavior used in the Western world to describe beings since at least the mid-18th century, when Linnaeus published his System Natura, that is overly mechanistic and reductive. It does not allow for the apprehension of trees as growing beings. The notion of trees as beings that become part of the group that was part of the group's conversation that evening in Cafe Bene. It was particularly evident when we discussed roots and height. This is because street trees have a very particular history in LA, and they do not necessarily have the goodwill of the general public. The giant Washingtonia robusta, seen here, emblematic of cities like Venice Beach, LA, and Santa Monica, was a byproduct of the early 1930s. While often associated with the Olympics, it was more likely a result of a series of public works programs to try and increase employment during the Great Depression. The tree is listed by the selection guide as drought resistant, but its height, spiked fronds, and falling fruit make it something of a nuisance in the eyes of many Los Angelinos. The environmental services manager reiterated this and noted that it was a troublesome species, but does not behave in an acceptable fashion. Instead, it creates a problematic entanglement, as only active management by humans makes it an acceptable species. In particular, its height was a problem. It obscures the hoardings of local businesses, so it damages commerce, can be problematic for telephone lines, so it affects communication, and its spiked fronds have to be cut by men standing on ladders and wearing gloves. Also, the seeds make property owners who are responsible for the street directly in front of their lot potentially liable for slip and fall claims, which is a big deal in Los Angeles. Other trees are also regarded as creating problematic entanglements. When Angelinos react negatively to street trees, they often mention Ficus macrophyllae, otherwise known as the Moreton Bay fig. Its branching roots create significant problems for pedestrians as they cause structural damage to the pavement, which renders it uneven. Additionally, its leaves create slip and fall hazards, and its flowers produce allergens. Thus, when discussing suitable trees, the fig tree was at the bottom of the list. Koreanness in the form of trees had to be carefully cultivated and managed. Species exhibiting inappropriate behavior could not be allowed. 5 months later, WCKNC's board had changed, and with it, the commitment to trees as a representation of Koreanness, or indeed Koreanness at all, vanished. However, it was only at this point that the Bureau of Sanitation began to make concrete cuts. The city moves at a far slower speed than the board changes. As they progressed, they encountered a Korean-American businessman who strenuously objected to them making a cut in front of his business. He stated there was no circumstance in which he desired a tree in front of his business. He called WCKNC and complained, but unsatisfied with the board's response, he refilled the hole himself. Irrespective of what sort of tree it was, he did not wish to be trapped in a relationship with it. Right, so now moving back to Mongolians more concretely. Just after 10 on a Friday morning in October, a delegation assembled in a LA City Council person's offices. It included several members of the Los Angeles Mongolian Association, Mongolia's Boyce consul and his deputies, and myself. The room was full of photos, family, staff, and electorate, other politicians, and of the city as well. The occupant's life was woven together from all these strands. We didn't wait long for the council person to show up. He arrived swiftly. Greetings and introductions were made, hands enthusiastically and forcefully shaken. Everyone was acknowledged. The councilperson immediately inquired about the creation of Little Mongolia, the Lama president's attempt to rename an area of Koreatown. The president responded that it did not exist yet. It needs to, the councilperson stressed with righteous enthusiasm. The consul agreed. He declared it my #1 priority. A brief discussion of a potential site followed, then the topic changed. Things drew to a close. The councilperson called for a photo. They wrote the Mongolians and I into a pose that looked like something from a sports team huddle. Next, the councilperson led us to the main council chambers, the John Ferrara room. Its marble columns, high ceiling, and flags spoke of a history woven from civic ambition and settler colonialism. The flag of green, gold, and red there is the flag of Nueva España, the initial sort of colonizing power. The councilpersons stood at the lectern and their voice boomed as they formally introduced the consul general to their fellow council members. Meanwhile, the public sat in the pews looking on and the press filmed it all. The councilperson's introduction made good use of the limited Mongolian phrases he learnt 30 seconds earlier. They then presented the consul with a certificate signed by the councilperson, the council president, and the mayor. Afterwards, the council president jocularly declared that every time the councilperson introduced a cultural group, they appeared to learn a new language. And after some good-natured laughter, the delegation left the room. The city council's formal recognition of an ethnic community's representatives at one of their thrice weekly meetings was not unusual. On particularly significant occasions, there would be cultural performances during a council meeting. For example, in 2014, I was there during the Lunar New Year when there was a dragon dance in the council chamber. Recognition was usually tied to groups' histories in the city's landscape. By this criteria, the Mongolians' presence in the meeting might have seemed unusual. Mongolians had been present in the city since the mid-1990s, and community organizations like the Los Angeles Mongolian Association really only begin to appear in the 2000s. So it's sort of early if you have a notional development curve. Despite the councilperson's eagerness, gaining support for a little Mongolia in Koreatown would be difficult. Several years earlier, Bangladeshi community organizers had submitted an application to rename a sizable portion of Koreatown as Little Bangladesh, without notifying any of the other communities in Koreatown. In doing so, they were symbolically claiming the area as their own and giving their people a place in the LA landscape. This was what they proposed in their application. The explanation they gave in their application was simple enough. We have a lot of people of our Bangladesh community living within that boundary. So we have people, so we should have this space. The mainly Korean WCKNC responded in the language of economics. Koreatown was no longer just where people lived, it was a potential site for foreign investment from the Pacific region. Renaming a portion of the area would damage its economic viability. Even outside of Koreatown, there had been criticism of the Bangladeshis. One councilperson had weighed in, claiming the Bangladeshis had not invested enough in the neighborhood. They can have a statue, he said, but it's too early for a name. Investment, in the sense he was using the term, alluded to a landscape which bore witness to their enduring presence. Finally, Steve Lopez, an influential LA Times columnist, had dismissed the Bangladeshi claim. He argued that all such exercises in renaming were cynical attempts to make money. And even if they were not, the landscape being claimed contained more evidence of Central American presence in the form of storefronts than a Bangladeshi one. You can see here, this is what they finally got, this sort of 10 blocks, which is considerably less than they had hoped for. This argument over Little Bangladesh was entangled with a number of strands of settler colonial thought. WCKNC's and the councilperson's responses are in part indicative of the valorization that I mentioned earlier. This prioritizing of economics as justification for recognizing claims to territory is a descendant of arguments like terra nullius that had justified native dispossession. One of Lopez's arguments also relied on this logic of visible improvement. His other derived from a belief that neoliberalism had so tainted ethnic ownership that any attempt at renaming was about money. This second line of thinking, as John and Jean Komarov have observed, has also been used to critique Native American attempts at preserving their culture through monetizing it. Finally, the Bangladeshi organizers' argument was also contingent on presence, an argument that the English had used when contesting Spanish colonial claims way back in the Elizabethan era. Fueled by these opposing ideas, the dispute rumbled on for several years before being acrimoniously resolved. A little Bangladesh was created, but it was considerably smaller than that which had been applied for. Lama's president was both aware of this acrimony and its implications for the technical processes that the organization would have to undertake to gain a little Mongolia. She knew that 500 signatures from residents were required to submit an application to rename an area, and that no one area of Koreatown was home to that many Mongolians, so they would need the support of the neighborhood's larger communities. She also knew the process required the approval of the city council, and that the community stood a better chance if their existence was mentioned in documents held by the LA City Archive. Hence, Lama's strategy for gaining support for their bid for formal recognition of a toponym relied upon making the Mongolian presence less fleeting and more visible in Koreatown's political taskscape. They attempted to accomplish this through joining the WCKNC and participating in their events. However, their success was limited at best, as not even all of the WCKNC board members were aware of this goal. Some Mongolian community members dismissed the project as a pipe dream, while others complained that Lama should instead spend their energy and resources on the needs of the community. Despite this, Little Mongolia remained an important goal for some. For a few, it would remind future generations of LA's Mongolian population of the sacrifices their forefathers had made, while for others, its commercial potential would create jobs. These goals were thus similar to those of the Bangladeshis. The councilperson's argument was partially about trade. Attracting foreign investment to LA through named areas had become part of the municipality's economic strategy. Additionally, I suspect they were enchanted by Mongolian culture. As the commoners have observed, the value of culture to capitalism rests on uniqueness, and the fear of taint derives from the concern that the latter would degrade the former's special quality. However, not all cultures are equally rare. LA would be one of the few cities in the world to have a Mongolian named neighborhood. It fitted well with the councilperson's boisterous vision of the city as globally significant. For the council, too, such a development would largely be about economics. Later in the evening, after the meeting I described above, Lama hosted a reception for him. His speech stressed the important role the diaspora had to play in attracting American investors to Mongolia. A Little Mongolia would serve as a location to redirect American investment towards Mongolia. Sort of a funnel, essentially. In LA, trees and toponyms histories are linked to the recognition of rights. If one keeps this in mind, then the goal of Korean trees shaping the Koreatown landscape and producing a lasting visibility through presence seems sensible. However, the debate as to whether California natives manipulated their landscape through burning underscores that recognition depends on learning to sense how tasks have changed the landscape. The impact of the tiny ripple of Mongolian activities is especially difficult to ascertain in Koreatown's densely populated taskscape, as this final section details. A hot summer day, Danzin and I had walked more than a mile trying to find a restaurant. A newcomer, he was homesick. He wanted xiaotathu, Mongolian for Chinese food, the sort you found specifically in Mongolia. But we failed to find any. Eventually, hunger got the better of us, and we entered a Korean restaurant rather reluctantly. Inside, a middle-aged woman brought us menus. Then she addressed Danzin in Korean. He swiftly corrected her, identifying himself as Mongolian. "I'm not Korean," he said, "I'm Mongolian." Danzig's experience was not unusual. In Koreatown, Mongolians were routinely misidentified by Korean Americans. In his case, his personal style, influenced by Korean trends, exacerbated the issue. Earlier, I had watched as he carefully gelled his hair into a side-swept fringe modeled on a variety of K-pop stars. His willowy form, tracksuit, aviators, and Von Dutch cap further lent itself to this interpretation. The ensemble reflected both South Korean popular culture's increasingly global reach, what's known as the Korean wave, and post-socialist Mongolia's consumption of South Korean pop culture. The waitress was unlikely to be aware of the latter. To her, Danzin was a Korean American, not a Mongolian aping Korean style. This was an example of the difficulties wrought by similitude, by similarity. Koreatown's seemingly Korean American landscape further legitimated her reasoning. Mongolians formed such a small proportion of Koreatown's population that unless one learned through prior encounter or conversation to be attentive to their presence in the landscape, one would not know that they were there. Danzin was the right body, in the right clothes, in the right place to be hailed or interpolated as Korean. In The Politics of Recognition, the philosopher Charles Taylor describes how misrecognition came to be regarded as harmful within liberal multicultural democracies. My Mongolian interlocutors would probably agree with this sentiment. Frequently, I was told how someone had cycled through a seemingly innumerable ethno-nationalities before being informed the person was Mongolian. When I naively inquired about how one could tell with certainty if a stranger was Mongolian, I was told it was largely about mannerisms, the same but anybody would tell you about how to distinguish a person. Mongolians, I was informed, walked in a particular fashion. When I asked one of my Mongolian interlocutors how confident she was in her ability to identify this Mongolian quality, she responded that she was very confident. 98%, she said. It was, for her, a byproduct of socialization. Without it, Mongolians were just as likely to misidentify each other as Gadad, foreigners, were. My interlocutors' assertions of their ability to identify Mongolianists did not always jibe with what I observed. In the summer of 2014, I was at a park to watch volleyball, a popular sport in the Mongolian diasporic community. The players were Mongolians of a mixture of ages and talents. Some were Soviet-era masters, others were US high school graduates, and still others were tyros. One player, a barefooted, tall, well-muscled man in his 20s, strode purposefully. Naran, an acquaintance who had played on his team, revealed that he had surprised her. I did not realize he was Mongolian when I first saw him, she said. His features were so broad. I assumed he was Middle Eastern, she clarified. Naran rationalized his facial features as problematic. She did not mention his stride. However, while she had previously been involved with community events several years ago, she had moved recently. This was one of the few Mongolian events she attended this year. "I've left the community," she often said to me, and thus she was not likely to recognize newcomers. The man she misrecognized was a temporary language student, a newcomer who had only been in Los Angeles a few months. Newcomers were a recurrent feature of LA life, and the community's dispersed nature meant even a regular attendee at community events would frequently make new acquaintances. Furthermore, the Mongolian community was super diverse. Structural factors meant its diversity transcended ethnicity. Many Mongolians regularly migrate between US cities. Throughout fieldwork, I encountered Mongolians who had lived in all sorts of places, from large southern cities like Lexington to tiny Midwestern university towns. Frequently, Mongolians living elsewhere in the United States and studying as students would come and live with their kinfolk over the summer. Once ensconced, they would spend the summer working to earn money before returning for the school year. For both Mongolians and non-Mongolians, the difficulty of recognizing a Mongolian presence in the landscape was also exacerbated by many Mongolians' economic activities. Koreatown had innumerable Korean, Bangladeshi, and Central American businesses, but almost no Mongolian economic presence. Indeed, or at least a visible economic presence. Indeed, and instead, most of the Mongolians I met were employed in valet parking, construction, food services, furniture removal, cosmetology, or long-distance trucking. The tasks they performed could not easily be identified by the marks they left on the landscape as Mongolian. Trucking is a good example of this. Recently, a growing number of men had become long-distance truckers. Away from LA for days on end, they had little time to participate in community life. In Koreatown, one might occasionally sense a truck parking for the night, but unless one knew the name of the company and something of the Mongolian language, one would not know that they were Mongolian. For example, this trucking company here is called Bolo Trucking, and its sign is a horse. Unless you knew something about both of those things, that would just appear as another truck in the landscape. Its Mongolianness is not in any way evident. Furthermore, the only contributions of their labor to the landscape of Koreatown were in the form of smog and noise from their trucks, neither of which were readily identifiable as Mongolian. I think we can all agree that in a city like Los Angeles, you can't ethnicize fog, or rather smog. Thus far, I have accounted for a failure to recognize Mongolians' presence in the landscape by emphasizing the tasks they were performing. Furthermore, I have argued that the ability to sense tasks is learned, and that an awareness of only certain types of tasks has a long history dating back to settler colonialism's beginnings in the area. These observations are entwined with the final element that I address, elimination. At the end of this volleyball tournament that I have been attending, exemplifies this well. As night fell on LA, Mongolians and I packed up and removed all traces of our presence. Gone were volleyball nets, tables and audio equipment, tents and flags. All that would seemingly remain were bent blades of grass, which would be erased by others undertaking other tasks. Elimination was not just a feature of Mongolian events, it was common to many cultural events in LA. On most occasions, it was justified by the multiple roles public spaces played. This was a particular issue in LA because, by contrast with Mongolia, long regarded in Western imagination as a land without fences, its landscape is famously restricted. As anthropologist Nathalie Boucher observes, LA has never made a priority of spaces where real flesh and blood contact happens. Spaces are often quasi-public, appearing open, but only to those meeting certain criteria, as anthropologist Marina Peterson has observed. Even truly public spaces, such as parks, are circumscribed by legal conventions. For groups with a physical presence in the landscape, named neighborhoods, restaurants, memorials, businesses, or simply numerous bodies, recognition is not solely dependent on publicly held events. For Mongolians, this sort of elimination makes an important contribution to the invisibility of their presence in the landscape, and by extension, the failure of others to recognize their existence in a more than fleeting fashion. When you only have public events and you have to unpack and completely remove any presence of your public event, who even knows that it happened unless you were there? So to conclude, a particular form of recognition exists in LA, a fleeting form with many parties being uncertain of one another's existence. This ignorance has often made non-Anglophone Angelenos the target of investigation by both policymakers and academics seeking to solve what they regard as their problematic ways of life. One might argue that the city's size is a significant cause of this lack of recognition, but I contend that its problematic settler colonial heritage plays an important role in defining the terms under which recognition is possible. One of these terms is concerned with the commodification of identity. In much of the literature, the existence of ethnic identity as a commodity is regarded as a very recent product of neoliberalism, a sort of late modernity. However, LA's history militates against treading such a well-worn analytical path. Ethno-racial distinctiveness has long been a visible commodity in LA. It was sold and consumed at events like La Fiesta and in places like China City. The origins of this consumptive practice lie in earlier colonial beliefs about the appropriate usage of land. Immigrant others are politically recognized only so long as they are capable of inhabiting the landscape in the correct manner. This involves undertaking tasks that signify that one is largely the same, yet slightly different from Anglophone settlers. Different enough to be enticing, but the same or similar enough so as to not be threatening. That's how it goes. This position represents a challenge for Mongolians. Some would dearly like to be recognized as a means of preserving a collective identity, but much of what they are is not easily commodifiable. The possibility of recognizing Mongolians' existence is further diminished by the erasure activity from the landscape. Mongolians in LA might seem to have been eliminated, but just as there exists a shadow geography of which Mongolians are part. Moreover, the Mongolian presence is revealed through mundane bureaucratic documents like records of pot rentals, city council presentations, and long-distance truck drivers' licenses. These documents allow one to gain an awareness of the Mongolian presence in the city, even if you're not engaging in participant observation as I was. For some Mongolians, a toponym appears a desirable mechanism for securing recognition, but the recent challenges to Koreatown's status by Bangladeshis would suggest otherwise. In such circumstances, it is unsurprising that members of the Korean American community would seek to symbolically shore up Koreatown by planting Korean trees. Identity work is thus a multi-species endeavor that is contingent on the cooperation of a host of non-human beings to render one recognizable. However, as the history of LA demonstrates, non-human beings are themselves not necessarily durable. One thinks of the numerous trees and plants eliminated by settlers who introduced non-native species to the LA basin. As Schiffman observes, the early settlers themselves did not notice the vegetational changes. Instead, they regarded what they replaced as much the same as what they removed. Perhaps because of the scale of migration, the United States, unlike other Anglophone settler colonies, one thinks of Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, imagines itself as a nation of immigrants. However, being attentive to the history of LA, a city produced through two distinctly different waves of colonialism, reveals that settler colonialism structures the experience of immigrants. As such, I would argue that newcomers like Mongolians, and indeed all of us, have to think about how to negotiate our relationship as immigrants to a settler colonial environment so as not to repeat the mistakes of generations past. Something new has to come. Change must come.
A little bit about the history of why Koreatown the area was ever called Koreatown, sort of when and how that happened.
Sure. So I sort of alluded to this briefly, but I went through a lot, I realized. So Koreatown really comes into being in the 1970s as sort of a thing that businessmen are seeking to sort of brand the area. In part, it's about heritage concerns. In part, it's about business. So it's always a sort of a mixture of these things. I feel that sort of often these things are sort of represented as binaries in which it can only be one or the other. And when it's a binary, there's a bad and there's a good. And sort of economic activity is sort of looked at sort of as questionable in a sense, which is I disagree with. I think sort of it's just a perfectly justifiable motive to have sort of a mixture of concerns about things. So, and it happens in the 1970s. Prominent Korean businessmen begin to petition Mayor Bradley, and in 1980, Mayor Bradley erects that sort of sign that was at the front of my talk. Except it also doesn't at the same time because Mayor Bradley failed to file the appropriate paperwork, and so everybody believed that legally Koreatown was Koreatown at this point. But in actuality, legally Koreatown was not Koreatown. And when the Bangladeshis attempted to, sort of from the Korean American perspective, claim jump Koreatown and rename a large portion of it as Little Bangladesh, it was discovered that the city had never processed the paperwork that would make Koreatown Koreatown. And so Koreatown sort of ironically both dates as an ambition from the 70s and as a realized goal from sort of the the beginning of the 21st century.
So I thought your talk was interesting. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought your talk was interesting in that you didn't mention any places of worship and whether they're marks on the geography of LA. And I also wanted to ask you, people who've gone to Mongolia that I've spoken to talk about a lack of political imagination among Mongolians in that they often gravitate politically to strongmen leaders. And I was wondering if you had any sense of who new Mongolian people might support for this coming presidential election, whether they're entitled to vote or not, or whether only their children are allowed to vote. Do they vote like other immigrant communities? Do they usually go Democratic? Do the people who are voting are only the young people and therefore more left-wing or progressive ideas? Do they vote like their Latin neighbors? Are they like other Asians here in the Bay Area where the Asians sort of follow the lead of some of the more established Latin communities that are here already? Thank you.
Okay, so there are sort of two distinct questions there. So let me address the first one about places of worship. So the Mongolian community in Los Angeles is sort of composed of really of sort of two religious groups, as it were, Buddhists and evangelical Christians. Many of them actually ironically converted by Korean missionaries and attending evangelical Christian universities in Koreatown. Most of that worship, when it happens, is sort of distinctly Mongolian worship. There are sort of two Mongolian Christian congregations in Los Angeles that I'm aware of. Most of that worship actually happens in Korean Christian churches, so you wouldn't know that there was a sort of a Mongolian presence there because the worship would be taking place in a Korean Christian church. As regards sort of Buddhist worship, well, sort of there are Buddhist temples dotted throughout Los Angeles. Not all of the people who would necessarily identify themselves as sort of culturally Buddhists in the way that, say, many Americans would identify themselves as culturally Christians would necessarily attend Buddhist ceremonies on a regular basis. But when they do, they would be going to Tibetan Buddhist temples, if at all possible, to attend. There's a couple. There's one in Long Beach. There's a place that people go to in West LA. But again, these places are sort of not ethno-nationally specific, so to a layperson sort of standing around outside, you wouldn't identify these people as Mongolian anymore, if you would identify them as sort of any other sort of Asian population. Does that sort of answer that question? The second question you have about sort of, initially I thought you were asking about the sort of the Mongolian political election that had just happened in Mongolia, and what I was going to say was that sort of one of the reasons the consul comes down to LA is to register people and get them on the rolls, because if you're part of the diaspora, you can vote in Mongolian elections. In much the same way as Italians can vote in Italian elections despite living in the United States. With regards to sort of the current American political election, I haven't sort of been in the field when this is happening, so I mean, I should stress that I'm sort of relying on Facebook posts and sort of conversations with people online, as opposed to watching. And what people say online is very different than what necessarily people will do, in private. But I should sort of say beforehand that many Mongolians are on F1 visas, and F1 visa holders are not. That's a student visa, are not entitled to vote anyway. I have seen people arguing for Hillary, and I have seen people arguing for Donald Trump. I think sort of it's perhaps difficult, but I think sort of, to me, perhaps a more defining feature of Mongolian political life than perhaps sort of the big man theory, as it were, is a deep suspicion of politicians. If there were Mongolians, and I'm only speculating here, who were voting for Trump, I think that it would arrive out of a suspicion of Hillary Clinton as sort of, a beltway politician, and a representative of the status quo. But as I said, sort of, I'm largely thinking out loud here, because that's not a conversation that I've had, very much to do with. I mean, in general, sort of, when I think about politics, I prefer to think about the municipality or sort of the civic level as what's sort of most salient and most relevant for immigrants. In Los Angeles, they have this neighborhood association system, WCKNC, that I was sort of attending meetings for, the Wilshire Center Koreatown Neighborhood Council. And one of the things about this neighborhood association level of politics is that you don't have to have any sort of form of legal status within Los Angeles to participate and become an elected official. So the president of a Mongolian association, when I started my field work, sort of the extremely precocious young woman, became the secretary of the neighborhood council, and was notionally responsible for a budget of sort of a couple $1,000s a year, and was responsible for helping adjudicate planning decisions for a community of 120,000 people, because that's the population of Koreatown. So in some senses, I mean, rather than talking about national politics, I think when talking about immigrants, we need to talk about civic politics, because that's often the arena in which people are more easily included. I know that doesn't sort of straightforwardly answer your question, but yeah.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned sort of your social media contacts, and I'm wondering about the virtual space of the Mongolian community and diaspora versus the physical spaces.
Sure.
And just if you have any thoughts about and like the sort of the permanence and everything.
Oh yes, I have lots of thoughts about it, and in the longer version of this paper, I spend a lot of time talking about that, because you may only be left with bent blades of grass after a volleyball match, but the photos of that volleyball match circulate on Facebook extensively, and Mongolia, people in the Mongolian community use Facebook in particular a lot. There's sort of Facebook groups called things like Mongols Are, where people will sell things and buy things, and sort of public events and photos are circulated. And there's a site outside Facebook called the Sulsambar, which has sort of innumerable photos of everything from Sagansar, which is sort of translated as White Month, is sort of Mongolian New Year. So there's a lot of that, and those things are perhaps way more permanent, although equally they are, in a sense, impermanent, right? Because the difficulty of being online is that one is always at sort of the mercy of whichever of the terms of services of whatever sort of website you're a member of. So if for whatever reason they decide to sort of get rid of your photos, well, that's gone, But yes, there is a sort of Mongolian afterlife. But the difficulty is if you were not Mongolian, you would not even know that existed as a phenomena. And I mean, in some ways, it's very interesting because it extends the community in all sorts of ways. So people, Mongolians will come up to San Francisco, which has a much bigger NADAM, that sort of Mongolian sort of festival, the Free Manly Games, which is held in the summer, and they will take photos, and people who are not in San Francisco will see those photos and comment on them, and in some sort of extended sense become part of the Mongolian community in San Francisco without ever being in San Francisco in a way, and so I mean, sort of virtual in some senses is key, but it's also sort of a complicated realm with its own sets of sort of legal systems and what have you that sort of define the terms of engagement. But yeah, I mean, you're spot on that that's sort of a very, very important element. Yeah.
I have two small questions here. The first one is, when we call it Chinatown, Japantown, or Koreatown, besides the historical reason, right, you can see they have landmarks or events, but more important, I think, is the language. So I'm curious, because here in Oakland, even though it's openly say we have a Korean town, but nevertheless, if you go to Oakland, before you approach Chinatown, you see all the business sites with Korean language, no matter it's a church or a restaurant or a shop, right? So it's identity too. So I'm wondering, in LA, in the Mongolian community or the Korean town, like for any Mongolian, those shops or churches, or they have the at least like bilingual or like with the Mongolian language, the sign, first one. The second one is, as far as I observe here, racial tension and conflict actually is also obvious. For example, once in San Jose, there's a issue about they want to have a Vietnamese town too, something like that. They're all competing with their identity, something. So, but in some ways, also I noticed, like for example, in my small town Irvine here, I find many sushi restaurants is run by Mongolian here. So you can see, obviously there's some closeness between, like Japanese and Mongolians, but from others maybe don't observe. So I'm interested to know if in LA, in a Korean town, besides the Korean community and the Mongolian community, what's the relationship with other Asian communities?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Right. So I think that's sort of it. Yes. So the question of language. When I was there were sort of 3 or 4 Mongolian businesses, and they would recurrently, they were all on short leases, so they didn't actually own the land, and they would recurrently be evicted and be replaced by something else. So, the difficulty when you rent land and you don't own land is, in a place like Koreatown, the turnover on the lease is very quick. The other issue is that most of those visible Mongolian businesses are doing things like shipping. And they're not bilingual, they are monolingual, and they are sending things to Mongolia by and large. Other than that, usually what happens is Mongolian businesses in Los Angeles will take on names that will index Mongolianness, but will be in English. So, for example, my former Mongolian professor started a sort of a kindergarten for Mongolian children, which is called something sort of like Blue Sky, which, Blue Sky sort of being sort of a reference to Tengir, the eternal blue sky, which sort of, Mongolians traditionally worshipped. Another one of my acquaintances, he doesn't live in Mongolia, he lives in LA County, and he owns a sushi restaurant, and the sushi restaurant is called something like the Japanese word for wolf, but sort of it's being called the Japanese word for wolf in order to index Mongolianness whilst using a Japanese name. So that's usually what will happen. There is a real concern in the Mongolian community in LA about loss of language ability, and people often complain, well, actually, my child speaks better Korean than they do, Mongolian, and that's sort of, not having spaces becomes an issue. I mean, the community organization that I was working with, their lease came to an end, and they could not afford to renew it midway through my field work. And then they were having to sort of meet all over the place, and that was a real difficulty because the sorts of events that they organized in their space disappeared, and the opportunities to sort of educate children in Mongolian disappeared. And that sort of activity, I think, is really difficult to organize without state sponsorship. They would sort of look at what the Korean communities is doing and wondering, well, why can't we have that? And part of the reason they can't have that is because the government has not been able to create the opportunities for that to happen for their diasporic communities. So I hope that sort of goes some of the way to answering your question about sort of both the issue of signage, which is something it's very helpful that you observe that. That's something that anybody who's ever visited sort of Koreatown in LA will talk about, is sort of the innumerable signs that deposit everywhere. The second thing I suppose you were asking about was sort of what I would call sort of false signs in a sense. So you go to a Japanese sushi restaurant, you assume that it's sort of owned and run by Japanese people, but particularly if you open the door and go in the back in LA, often the chefs are all Latinos, because Latinos will cook anything in Los Angeles. They will sort of turn their hand to anything. The waiting staff often will be Mongolians, because Mongolians look suitably Asian for the purposes of sort of presenting to them to the public, and the owners might be Koreans. So what is if you assumed upon the basis of sort of a one-to-one that sort of sushi equal Japaneseness, you would be wrong, because sort of sushi in this sense is being sort of remade, through this sort of American, melting pot or salad or what have you.
On the closeness, seems like they're getting along, because Japanese already usually hire Mongolian employees here, but they wouldn't hire anyone from Lebanon, that I find as observed in our local area. We also have Taiwanese run this sushi restaurant. So just making me thinking about maybe the geopolitical.
Yes, no, that's very true. I think that sort of the Mongolian geopolitical position is usually one in which, in the context of LA, in which they haven't offended anybody and there are no rivalries, and so they're sort of able to pass quite freely into these other locations in a way that would not necessarily be possible for others. And you asked sort of more broadly about sort of Mongolian community relationships with other groups. There was a lot of bonding between the Japanese and the Mongolian community over sumo wrestling, for example, in particular. So professional sumo wrestling in Los Angeles is, the sort of the heavyweight champion for the longest time was a Mongolian man called Biamba. And so he had put on a series of performances in Little Tokyo, which was sort of, formerly the epicenter of the Japanese community in Los Angeles, but of course now Japanese Americans have sort of filtered out throughout the city. At the time, I remember one of my friends who had been on the board of Lama previously saying that sort of, the Japanese had become so enthusiastic about sort of the Mongolians in this particular valence that they had offered them the use of the Japanese community center because, they were so respectful of this sort of sumo wrestling talent. So, those sort of relationships happen in interesting ways. A lot of people who are involved in the import-export business, Mongolians, have often in the past worked with Russians, because the Russians had a pre-established presence in the docks. And so I interviewed sort of a couple people who's got their start in the import-export business by working with people from the Russian community in LA. And then often a lot of sort of the Mongolian events are held at banquet halls, and those banquet halls are often run by Armenians. And so there's sort of two axes along which things are working here. One is sort of, you know, a general sense of Asianness, and I mean that in the sense of, you know, East Asianness in particular, and then the other axis, as it were, is along the lines of we all experienced socialism together, us, the Kazakhs, the Armenians, the Russians, and, you know, thus we have some understandings. And in fact, one of my interlocutors once remarked that sort of the problem so far as Mongolians were concerned was that they looked East Asian, yet their history was sort of much closer to that of the Kazakhs and the Tajiks and the Turkmenis. And as a result, when people talked to Mongolians, they kept assuming that their history was similar to that of the sort of the Chinese and the Japanese or what have you. I mean, I know I'm making sort of significant leaps to sort of glom those things together, when in fact, if only they looked more Central Asian, then people would appreciate how very different Mongolia as a place was historically. So, yeah. So all of those things.
So I have a couple of questions. I'm the only one from the country of Mongolia.
Yeah.
And the first question is, what really attracts the Mongolian part of your research, as far as the landscaping and establishing Mongolian town in LA? The second question is, as you're doing this research, you mentioned about, you interviewed about 50 people. So just listening and hearing about the opinions and hearts, you think that Mongolians are very homesick and they're always love the country, Mongolia, they're unintegrated in U.S. So establishing a Mongol town story, like the work started in LA, is a very good idea of how, like, us as Mongolians maybe together, you know, in one landscape. So it actually brings the homesickness down, maybe. So that's a very good idea. So anyway, so now what is your opinion or input that you may be helping, since you're doing this research, what will help to actually get this town down?
What would help to achieve a Mongolia town? Well, I mean, you have to sort of, because the Mongolian population in Los Angeles is very, very small relative to the number of signatures you need to even get on the docket to have this considered. It's sort of reliant on the things that we've already been talking about, sort of having extremely good relations with the people that you live with, because you have to get them to sign off on this. It mainly, though, it requires political will, you know, the sort of constant engagement with local politicians and convincing them that this is sort of, you know, this is sort of a winning initiative. Because of term limits, you know, members of the city council eventually sort of become past their sell-by date. That isn't to say they still don't have influence significance, but it's just to say that that diminishes, and then you have to start the relationship over again. So you have to keep on if we're talking in very bare bones practical terms, you have to keep on cultivating that relationship and making yourself visible to the municipality for anything like that to occur. You know, and I mean, the woman, the female president who was in charge when this initiative really sort of caught fire for a brief period, was a past master at that sort of stuff. She was very, very, very good at forming these relationships with the city's political community. She was very, very good at going to Korean events and being visible in that way, and ensuring that everybody knew that she was Mongolian and what Mongolia meant. but the difficulty is that when all of this is voluntary, none of these are paid positions, and other people in the community want other things in a sense. There's always sort of trade-offs, and so it's very difficult. In my experience, what happens with community organizations like this is people just burn out. They get tired. Yeah.
Yeah. So that actually ties into a question I wanted to ask you. So a lot of the talk was this argument about settler colonialism, sort of mediating about who gets recognized and who doesn't, and at what point they do, which I think is fantastic, and it definitely mitigates our what we traditionally have as a recognition is an idea of demography. So there should just be enough. You just need enough people in your community, and then you'll get recognized, right? So this argument kind of mitigates that. What's the threshold? How many people do you need, right? There's this process of settler colonialism. But throughout the talk, a lot of the evidence is actually on the other side of it, what you just mentioned, which is this political process of participatory democracy. And so that's this, it's more of a vision of this dialectical process between communities organizing, coming to recognize that this is what they want, and then cultivating a relationship with authorities who have this kind of settler colonial idea about what's recognizable and what's not, which is economic activity. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about maybe thinking about that dynamic, that dialectical dynamic.
Yeah, I think sort of thinking in terms of thesis and antithesis is a good way to sort of think through it, because the settler colonial vision that I'm sort of propagating here, I really should underscore, is my vision of how the municipality is thinking about land use. What you have to, the Mongolians that I'm talking about here are at the stage where they're having to think about the process. Well, how do we even get to the stage where we can begin to sort of enter this conversation, and then it's only by having numbers that we can enter the conversation, and from that, the land use should follow, in a sense, So, yes, the approach, in that sense, it sort of swings backwards and forwards, as you sort of negotiate the relationship, you get told that you have to do these things in the form of land use to make yourself relevant. As you do those things, you become acknowledged, and then sort of, numbers come into play in a certain way. I'd have to think a little bit more about, I suppose, the sort of the formal element of numbers themselves, because that point about demography is interesting. I suppose that demands sort of further consideration on my part, and I'll have to sit down and really think about it.
For me, I don't know if that's actually necessary. For me, that's kind of the backdrop for all this. You're actually showing there's a political process that mitigates that relationship. It's not just, what does it mean to say you have enough numbers to be recognized? You're sort of saying that threshold gets negotiated over time.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think sort of there's a sense in which sort of the uniqueness I referred to earlier acts as, if you're unique enough, numbers matter less, if you're Mongolian or Tajik or Tibetan, numbers matter less. And perhaps, so I've been talking about this at the level of the city. I think there is perhaps work to be done. There is work to be done about how, particular, in terms of being historically particularistic, how in the context of the United States, Mongolians are a particularly evocative population that sort of people think about them in very particular ways. They have been mythologized in the West through sort of a series of Hollywood films, about Genghis Khan in particular. And so, that uniqueness plays well, and numbers become even less significant. Whereas, if I was making this argument about, Central Americans in particular, numbers would be seen as mattering more, because I think that sort of, historically Central Americans have been treated rather brutally and unfairly by all levels of the American political system. And so, there's more of a need to rely on numbers to evoke some sort of political power. So, I mean, it might be useful to think about like the political power of uniqueness as a quality, the scarcity, I mean, the sort of the significance of scarcity within the capitalist system is giving people a legitimacy that they otherwise wouldn't have. I don't know. So, I mean, I started out by doing research in Mongolia, an undergraduate, then master's student, looking at Mongolian hip-hop music and Mongolian nationalism. So, studying people like, Ice Top and Tatar and Joshua, these sort of big Mongolian hip-hop groups. And, while I was there doing that, one of the things they frequently complained about was the fact that they weren't making any money. The only money they made was by touring. And people were talking about touring the United States. And I sat there and, it made no sense to me how they could make any money by catching a transatlantic flight, because there's no direct flight between Mongolia and the US. You've either got to go to Korea, Russia, or China, and frequently you will then transition through, Japan. And so I thought, well, how the hell can you make any money doing this, So I became interested in what were these communities in the United States that could possibly support this sort of large-scale longue-durée touring practice, and so that's how I became interested in Mongolians in the United States. And then my first year as a graduate student in 2010, 2011, there was an ADAM held outside Los Angeles City Hall, and I went along. I didn't know which Mongolian community I was going to study at the time. Actually, I thought I was going to do something in Arlington with the Mongolians just outside DC. But, I went along, and, several things struck me. One, it seemed kind of weird. I mean, if you've ever been to Los Angeles, the City Hall is right next to the LA Police Department's main building, and I couldn't conceive of a situation in which any other recently arrived immigrant community would want to hold sort of a community event right next to right next to the center of police power in a municipal situation. Everything I'd learned about the Esberg studies up to that point suggested that they would want to do the exact opposite. And then secondly, somebody, the president of the association started talking about this little Mongolia. And, and I thought, wow, so not only are people, holding this cultural event in a very weird location, they're talking about renaming an area of a thing. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting. Like, making territorial claims in this way, what does it involve? How do you go about doing it? And why would you want to do it? Why would you put yourself through all of the labor of this process, when your community has all of these other really, really important concerns? Why is this important? Why is this necessary? And part of it is what you were mentioning, is this sort of sense of, for the proportion, the LA community is rather unusual and specific in a variety of ways, one of which is that a significant proportion of them are students, so they're not here for the long haul necessarily, so why would a group of people, many of whom are not here for the long haul, want to get invested in this process, and it is the ones who have reconciled themselves to the fact that they're having to stay, by and large, who are the impetus behind this. And, part of that impetus, is a sort of acknowledgement that sort of the Mongolian economy in particular is so unpredictable now as a result of being married to resource extraction, so sort of, copper and what have you, that people are uncertain of when, if ever, they could leave. And so they're making the best of a situation in which they find themselves often. And that becomes really interesting. And so it's in those circumstances that people got invested. And I sort of got invested because I thought, well, this is unusual. Why would a group of people who I thought were largely temporary, and everything, all my preliminary sort of discussions up to that point, all of the stuff that I'd done on social media, etc., all of the people I'd rung had suggested the community was there really only temporarily. so it struck me as interesting. So that was that's how I became involved. It was sort of, as you know, with a great many research projects initially, and so that was my first year of grad school. It was only sort of 3 or 4 years later that I actually got into the field for a significant period of time. But that's how it happened. It was entirely happenstance, you know, that particular angle struck me. And I think if I'd done this project somewhere else, I mean, you know, there are things about settler colonialism which are true of the United States as a whole. You can't escape them. But there's something about California as a very particular kind of place, and there's something about LA as a particular kind of city, in the form of the sorts of Mongolians that it attracts to the city, you know. And I mean, just that sort of, you know, having, you know, that very particular history of being colonized twice in a particular way that makes all of these questions really interesting and leads to, ineluctably, I think, to sort of the approach that I'm taking.